They buried her alive because Satan asked for a sacrifice. In the next 20 minutes, you'll uncover how a group of Italian teenagers turned a rock band into a death cult, and what forensic investigators found in that shallow forest grave changed everything about the case. In the quiet foothills of northern Italy, where the Alps taper into the fog-drenched province of Varese, there is a stretch of woodland called the Bosco delle Streghe, the Forest of Witches. Locals had long avoided it. Hunters spoke of strange lights at night, of animal bones arranged in circles, of teenagers who came here to drink and never quite seemed the same when they left. But it wasn't until the winter of 2004 that the police finally understood why. Because underneath the roots of a pine tree, buried in a shallow grave, they found a young woman named Chiara Marino. She was 19 years old. Her body had been stabbed and mutilated, and when investigators asked why, the answer came back in a whisper from the boy who put her there. He said Satan had demanded it. This is the case of Le Bestie di Satana, the Beasts of Satan, a cult of Italian teenagers who between 1998 and 2004 murdered at least 3 people, drove others to suicide, and terrorized an entire region in the name of a devil they were never quite sure they believed in. And what makes their story so disturbing is not the ritual, not the black candles, not the pentagrams scrawled in blood. It's how ordinary they were, how suburban, how close they lived to you. Tonight on Dark Cases, we go deep into the forest, deeper into the police files, and deepest of all, into the minds of the killers themselves. To understand the beasts of Satan, you first have to understand the town of Busto Arsizio. It is not a place that appears in Italian travel brochures. Sitting between Milan and the Swiss border, it is a gray, industrial commuter town of factories, apartment blocks, and empty piazzas. In the late 1990s, it was also a town with a thriving heavy metal scene. Local teenagers, alienated and bored, gathered in rehearsal rooms and cheap bars to play thrash, black metal, and hardcore. Among them was a band that would later give its name to the entire police investigation. The band was called Beasts of Satan. Their music was, by most accounts, mediocre. Their lyrics obsessed over Satanism, sacrifice, and death. And their frontman was a 20-something named Marco Zampolo, though the true center of gravity in the group would soon become a very different figure. His name was Andrea Volpe. Volpe was 22 years old in 1998. Thin, pale, with long dark hair and a fixation on occult literature he barely understood, he had grown up in the nearby village of Somma Lombardo. His parents were middle class. He worked odd jobs. He was, by every measure, unremarkable. Except that Andrea Volpe had convinced himself, and slowly convinced everyone around him, that he was chosen, that he had a direct line to the devil, and that Satan required blood. The first victim was a girl named Chiara Marino. She was 19, a music fan from the nearby town of Lecco, and she was dating a member of the Beasts of Satan scene. Chiara was, by all accounts, kind, curious, and a little lost. She was drawn to the underground world of Italian black metal, to the leather jackets and the late nights, to boys who wrote songs about eternity. On the night of January 24th, 1998, she went with Andrea Volpe, his girlfriend Elisabetta Ballerin, and 2 other friends into the Bosco delle Streghe. They told her they were going to perform a ritual. What Chiara didn't know was that Andrea and Elisabetta had spent weeks planning her murder. According to Volpe's own later confession, they had come to believe that Chiara was the reincarnation of the Virgin Mary. And to prove their loyalty to Satan, they needed to kill her. They stabbed her multiple times. When she was still alive, wounded and bleeding, they threw her into a grave they had dug earlier that day. They buried her while she was still breathing. Then they poured beer into the earth as an offering, drove back to Busto Arsizio, and went to a pizzeria. Nobody reported Chiara missing at first. Her family assumed she had run away with her boyfriend. The metal scene assumed she had gotten tired of them and moved on. For 6 years, her body lay under the pines, and Andrea Volpe kept killing. The second murder happened on the same night. Its name has largely been lost to time, because the second victim was Chiara's boyfriend, Fabio Tallis, who was 17 years old. Fabio was also lured into the forest that night, though whether he knew what was going to happen to Chiara has never been fully established. What the police would later reconstruct is this. After Chiara was buried alive, Fabio panicked. He tried to leave. Andrea Volpe and another cult member, Mario Maccione, then turned on him. They stabbed him repeatedly, killed him, and buried him in the same forest, only a few meters from Chiara's grave. Fabio's father, Michele Tollis, would spend the next 6 years of his life searching for his son. He printed flyers, he posted on early internet forums. He drove to metal concerts across northern Italy, showing Fabio's picture to strangers. He begged the police to investigate the Beasts of Satan circle, and for 6 years he was ignored. The official theory was that Fabio had run away, perhaps to Amsterdam, perhaps to join a squat in Berlin. Nobody wanted to believe that a group of local teenagers had murdered him in a forest 20 minutes from home. Michele Tollis's obsession would eventually crack the case wide open. But before it did, the Beasts of Satan would strike again. Between 1998 and 2004, the group continued to meet, drink, take drugs, and talk about Satan. Members came and went. Some drifted away. Others, according to prosecutors, were psychologically dominated by Volpe to the point that they could no longer distinguish his fantasies from reality. One member, a young woman named Mariangela Pizzata, would become the third confirmed murder victim. Mariangela was 27 years old. She had briefly dated Andrea Volpe. When the relationship ended, she made a mistake that would cost her life. She asked for money he owed her. On the night of January 18, 2004, Volpe and his new girlfriend, 17-year-old Elisabetta Dozio, invited Mariangela to a house in the town of Gola Secca. What Mariangela didn't know was that Volpe had decided she needed to be silenced. He was afraid she knew too much about the earlier killings. He was afraid she would talk. When she arrived, Elisabetta Dozio drew a pistol and shot Mariangela in the face. She survived the first shot. Bleeding, terrified, she tried to crawl away. Andrea Volpe then took a shovel and beat her to death. They buried her in the garden of the same house. And this time, they were sloppy, because a neighbor had seen something. A neighbor called the police. And within days, the entire structure of the Beasts of Satan began to collapse. When the Carabinieri arrived at the house in Gola Secca, they found the freshly turned earth almost immediately. Mariangela Pizzata's body was recovered within hours. What happened next is one of the strangest twists in modern Italian criminal history. Because Andrea Volpe, once in custody, did not resist, he did not lawyer up, he did not deny. Instead, he began to talk, and he could not stop talking. Over the course of days, then weeks, Volpe described the murder of Mariangela in detail. Then, unprompted, he described the murder of Chiara Marino 6 years earlier. Then Fabio Tollis. He told the investigators where the bodies were buried. He named other cult members. He described rituals, oaths, sexual coercion, drug binges. He led police into the Bosco della Strega and stood at the base of a pine tree and told them to dig. And underneath the roots, exactly where he said they would be, the officers found the skeletal remains of Chiara and Fabio, side by side, 6 years after they had vanished. For the Tollis family, it was the end of a nightmare and the beginning of another. Michele Tollis, who had been dismissed and mocked for years, was proved right. His son had been murdered by the very people he had accused. And the Italian public, which had never heard of the Beasts of Satan, suddenly could not look away. The investigation that followed was one of the most complex in recent Italian judicial history. Prosecutors identified a core group of 6 defendants, though the wider circle of the Beasts of Satan may have included as many as 20 people who knew of the killings and said nothing. The central figures were Andrea Volpe, his former girlfriend Elisabetta Ballerin, Mario Maccione, Elisabetta Dozio, Nicola Sapone, and a man named Paolo Leoni. Nicola Sapone, in particular, drew the attention of investigators. Older than the others, with a fascination for occult and Nazi imagery, prosecutors described him as the true ideological architect of the group. If Volpe was the executioner, Sapone was the philosopher. It was Sapone, they argued, who provided the theological framework of demonic sacrifice that Volpe carried out. Sapone denied it. He denied everything. But the testimony of the other cult members, particularly Volpe and Maccione, was devastating. And the picture that emerged was not one of a coherent satanic religion. It was one of confused, drugged, damaged young people using the language of Satanism to justify violence they already wanted to commit. Forensic psychologists, who examined the group, found little evidence of genuine occult belief. What they found instead was profound emotional immaturity, heavy drug use, and a group dynamic in which one dominant personality had convinced the others that murder was not only permitted, but required. The trials began in 2005 and produced verdicts that shocked even the prosecutors. Andrea Volpe, whose cooperation had cracked the case, was sentenced to 30 years in prison. His girlfriend, Elisabetta Dozio, who had shot Mariangela in the face at 17 years old, was sentenced to 16 years, later reduced due to her age at the time of the crime. Mario Macchione received 30 years. Nicola Sapone, despite maintaining his innocence, was sentenced to life imprisonment. Elisabetta Ballerini, Volpe's original girlfriend and co-participant in the murder of Chiara Marino, received 24 years. Paolo Leone was convicted of lesser charges. But beyond the direct killings, prosecutors also documented what they called the collateral deaths of the cult. At least 2 young men associated with the group had died by suicide in the years surrounding the murders. One of them, a young man named Michele, had been present at rituals and had apparently been threatened with death if he ever spoke. He hanged himself in 2004, shortly before the police discovered Mariangela's body. Whether his suicide was directly caused by the beasts of Satan will never be known. But his family believes it was, and so do the prosecutors. The total human cost of the beasts of Satan, when you include those they psychologically destroyed, may be far higher than 3. And this brings us to the question that lingers over the entire case, the question that Italian journalists have argued about for 2 decades. Was it really about Satan? Because if you look at the evidence, if you strip away the imagery of pentagrams and black candles, what you find at the core is something much older and much sadder. You find a controlling young man who wanted power over the people around him. You find drugs, particularly cocaine and heavy alcohol use, distorting judgment. You find teenagers so desperate to belong that they would agree to almost anything. You find sexual manipulation, jealousy, and in the case of Mariangela Pizzotta, a simple desire to silence a witness. The Satanism was, in many ways, a costume, a vocabulary, a way of dressing up ordinary human evil in clothes that made the perpetrators feel special. Andrea Volpe himself, in later prison interviews, would admit that he never really believed in the devil. He said he believed in the feeling that Satan gave him, the feeling of being important, the feeling of being feared, and that perhaps is the darkest revelation of the entire case. That the killers did not need a real devil to do what they did. They only needed the idea of one. And the idea, wrapped in music and drugs and adolescent rage, was more than enough. Today, more than 20 years after the murder of Chiara Marino, the Bosco della Strega still stands. Locals say the pine tree where she was buried was cut down. Others say it is still there, unmarked, indistinguishable from the trees around it. The house in Gola Secca where Mariangela Pizzotta was shot has changed owners. Andrea Volpe was released from prison on parole in 2022 after serving less than the full length of his sentence, a fact that outraged the families of his victims. Michele Tallis, Fabio's father, has become an outspoken voice against occult-linked violence and has written a book about his search for his son. He says he has forgiven no one. Chiara Marino's family has largely stayed out of the public eye, and the Italian metal scene, which for years lived under the shadow of the beasts of Satan, has spent 2 decades trying to reclaim its reputation, insisting correctly that black metal did not kill Chiara and Fabio. Andrea Volpe did. But the case remains, in Italian collective memory, a warning. A warning about what happens when isolated young people, deprived of meaning, are handed a story about themselves that flatters their worst instincts. A warning about how quickly ordinary suburbs can produce extraordinary horror. And a warning about how long a father may have to search, alone, before anyone believes him. If this case gripped you, subscribe to Dark Cases and turn on the bell. Every week, we go deep into the files the world tried to forget. And if you know someone who thinks satanic panic was just a myth, share this video with them. The beasts of Satan were very real, and they lived 20 minutes from a normal town.